My parents kicked me out for their golden child, then demanded I keep paying rent and bills, so I made them regret it. I 27M, always knew I was the backup son in my family. You know how some parents pretend they love all their kids equally? Mine didn't even try to hide their favoritism. My brother Dan was their pride and joy. Me? I was just there. Growing up in Minneapolis, my mom would beam whenever Dan walked into a room. She'd corner people at church or the grocery store to brag about Dan's latest accomplishment, while I stood like a shadow. When he left for Northwestern, she was depressed for months, called him daily like she was going through withdrawal. It wasn't that they hated me. I just wasn't Dan. He played football and got attention with his charismatic personality, being an obnoxious loudmouth. I was more reserved but still athletic. I wrestled in high school and placed at state twice, but my trophies ended up in the basement while Dan's participation ribbons from elementary school football got prime display in the living room. His most improved certificate from 4th grade football hung in the hallway until I moved out. I figured out early that no matter what I achieved, I'd never measure up to St. Dan. Even when I graduated with honors in business management and landed a solid job at a medical equipment company, my mom's response was, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear Dan might be up for promotion?" Dan had been up for promotion 5 times and never got it, probably because he spent more time networking at bars than working. When I was 23 and working for a year after college, my parents dropped their good news. They were retiring. Mom had been doing part-time jobs at clothing stores, and Dad was done being an insurance adjuster. Their plan? I'd move back home to help out until Dan had kids, then they'd move to Colorado to be near him. Fast forward 4 years. Dan still hadn't produced the grandkids they wanted. He was struggling. Him and his wife Melissa could barely pay their bills in Denver. Last Christmas, he spent the weekend complaining about his life while wearing $300 jeans and a new watch, talking about how the system was keeping him down. He barely acknowledged me, treating me like the family dog. Meanwhile, I was holding everything together. I'd become regional sales manager, started paying rent to help with their expenses, took care of the house and yard. I even remodeled their bathroom and built a deck in the backyard myself. My life was stable. I had friends, played hockey, and dated when I had time. But no matter what I did, Mom still talked about Dan like he was God's gift to humanity. When I closed a major account that boosted my commission by thousands, Mom asked if I could loan Dan money because he was going through a rough patch. He'd leased a BMW he couldn't afford. This wasn't the first time they'd asked me to bail him out. Every family gathering was the Dan show. If he called on holidays, everyone crowded around the phone like the president was calling. If he visited, my parents spent weeks preparing his favorite foods and cleaning his room like royalty was coming. My birthday? Box cake. Dan's birthday? 3 days of cooking and the whole extended family invited. Then a few months ago, Dan lost his job. Since him and Melissa were living paycheck to paycheck, maxing out credit cards to maintain their image, they were screwed. Mom acted like this was the best news ever, practically bouncing at dinner. "This is perfect," she squealed. "Dan and Melissa can move in while he gets back on his feet, and maybe they'll finally start a family." My stomach dropped. She'd been waiting for this for years. Not once did she ask what I thought. I was just expected to go along with whatever Dan needed. A few nights later, they sat me down for a family meeting. They wanted me to move out. There just wasn't enough room for everyone, Mom said with a fake sweet voice. "Besides, it's time for you to focus on finding a wife and starting your own family." The kicker, they still expected me to keep paying rent after I left. I sat there feeling sucker punched. For 4 years, I'd put my life on hold to help them. I'd been responsible while Dan lived hundreds of miles away. Now they were kicking me out so Golden Boy and his wife could take my place? Dad must have seen I was about to lose it because he quickly said I should take time to think. But I didn't need time. For the first time, I saw my parents for what they were. It was never about being fair or appreciating what I did. It was always about Dan. I asked, "So let me get this straight. You want me to move out of the house I've been maintaining and paying for so Dan can move in, and you still want me to pay rent after I leave? Mom said, well, we're on a fixed income now, and Dan will need time to find a job. It would just be until he gets back on his feet. And how long will that be? I asked. She waved dismissively. Oh, you know Dan. He's so talented, he'll find something in no time. Right. Just like all those other times he was about to hit it big. By morning, my emptiness had hardened into rage. I kept replaying every family dinner where they talked about Dan instead of my career. Every time Mom showed off his high school jersey while my wrestling trophies gathered dust. Every sign that I was just a placeholder until they could get their golden child back. They wanted me out but expected me to pay their bills? Hell no. I wasn't going to be their ATM anymore. I told them I'd think about it, but my mind was made up. I was done being their backup plan. Over the next week, I quietly packed my stuff. Started with important papers and valuables, then clothes and essentials. I didn't tell them what I was doing because I knew I'd lose it if they complained. I'd accumulated quite a bit over the years: weights, equipment, books, clothes. I'd built a collection of tools working on the house and wasn't leaving them for Dan to pawn. I carefully packed my granddad's old toolbox, the one real inheritance I'd gotten, making sure every socket and wrench was accounted for. While packing, I found a new place to live. Since I'd been paying a big chunk of their mortgage anyway, I could afford my own apartment. Found a decent place 15 minutes from work. 2 bedrooms, balcony, and most importantly, it was mine. I signed the lease on Thursday and arranged to move in over the weekend, all while my parents thought I was thinking about their proposal. Little did they know I was extracting myself from their lives. Leaving that night was intense. I waited until after midnight, partly because it felt like a prison break and partly because I couldn't handle their questions. I had already moved most of my stuff gradually, telling my parents I was reorganizing, when they noticed boxes disappearing. This last trip was for my bed, remaining clothes, and gaming setup. I left my house key on the counter with a note, found my own place. Don't contact me about rent. Simple, direct, and to the point. Everything our relationship wasn't. I loaded the last of my stuff into my truck and drove away without looking back. The next morning, I blocked my parents and Dan everywhere. For the first time in years, I felt free. 3 weeks later, Uncle Steve called. Kyle, your parents are about to lose the house. Steve revealed the truth: Dan had been jobless for 6 months. My parents had been secretly sending him thousands monthly and took out a second mortgage without telling me. They borrowed against the house, then expected me to cover their mortgage while they bailed out Dan? Exactly. They'll lose the house if they miss more payments. Why is that my responsibility? They're your parents. Family takes care of each other. Where was Dan when they needed help? He's been bleeding them dry while I kept the roof over their heads. The betrayal cut deep. I thought about the house. I'd spent weekends repairing it. I didn't want that work wasted if foreclosed. I made them an offer. When I arrived, Mom looked exhausted. Dad barely met my eyes. Dan and Melissa were there too. I know about the second mortgage, I said. Steve told me everything. My proposal: I'd take over the house completely, in my name. They could stay, but Dan and Melissa would pay fair rent. Mom hesitated. This is our family home. We're not just signing it over. It's your chance to keep it instead of losing it. Dan erupted. You can't take what's not yours. This is my inheritance. I laughed. Your inheritance? You've barely been here in 10 years. I've been caring for Mom and Dad, paying bills while you bled them dry. I'm not stealing anything, I said. But I won't throw money into a sinking ship. If you stay, contribute. Dad spoke. We'll think about it. Take your time. But the bank won't wait. As I left, Dan muttered, You've always tried to prove you're better than me. I smiled. I don't have to try. I just show up. A week later, Melissa called. Dan hadn't paid anything despite the foreclosure notice. I don't want to lose the house, she said. Your offer is fair. I've tried finding work, but Dan says I don't need to. He plays games all day while your parents panic. I made a new offer. If Dan refused to pay rent, he had to leave. I can't kick my brother out, but I can set terms for my house. The next meeting was chaos. Dan exploded when I mentioned rent. I stood firm. You think you're better than me, he shouted. This isn't about favorites, I replied. It's about responsibility. You've had a free ride. Now the bills due. Prospects don't pay mortgages. My parents sided with Dan. Mom kept saying he was going through a difficult time. If you won't accept my help, there's nothing more I can do, I said. Months passed. My life improved. I started dating Sarah, got promoted, took jiu-jitsu classes. Then Melissa called again, sobbing. The foreclosure was happening. Dan had refused my offer. I can't do this anymore, she cried. Dan maxed our cards. Your parents' health is suffering. I made one final offer. I'd buy the house completely with immediate title transfer. Everyone could stay, but Dan must pay rent or leave. Surprisingly, my parents agreed. Their fear of homelessness outweighed protecting Dan. The day we signed papers was surreal. Mom dabbed tears. Dad looked defeated. Dan didn't show. Just like that, I became owner of my childhood home. Dan never paid rent. Every month brought a new excuse. After 3 months, I evicted him legally. When the notice was served, Dan went ballistic. Mom collapsed in tears. Dad just stared blankly. My parents were furious, accused me of being heartless. This is my house now, I said. I've given Dan more chances than he deserves. He's your brother. Mom cried. The same way you had no problem kicking me out for him, I replied. To my surprise, they actually left. Uncle Steve took them in. Melissa didn't last a week with them. She showed up at my door. I'm done, she said. Your mom still treats Dan like he's 12. I let her stay until she found a job and her own place. She eventually filed for divorce. As for me, everything got better. I renovated the house. A year later, Sarah moved in. We married in a small ceremony, didn't invite my parents or Dan. She opened her own physical therapy practice, and I started my own medical equipment distributorship. Then about 6 months ago, Dad called for help. Steve had given them 30 days to leave. What about Dan? I asked. He moved to Florida. Said he needed a fresh start. Hasn't called in months. So now you're calling me? After everything? Son, please, Dad's voice cracked. We were wrong about you. We chose Dan every time. There's an apartment over the garage, I said. You can stay temporarily, with conditions. You pay what you can. You don't mention Dan? And you acknowledge you were wrong. They moved in last month. Mom cried when she saw the improvements I'd made. Dad actually shook my hand and looked me in the eye. They've been walking on eggshells around me. Last week I overheard Mom on the phone. My son Kyle owns his own business now, she was saying, with that proud tone she used to reserve only for Dan. Mom's been trying to make amends. Dad apologized last weekend. Said he'd always been proud of me but didn't know how to show it. It was too little, too late, but it was something. As for Dan, last I heard he got fired from his bartending job and was asking Mom for money again. She told him she couldn't help anymore. 2 weeks ago, I got an email from Dan. I hope you're happy now that you've turned everyone against me. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, but then I remember all those years I spent as the afterthought. I refused to keep being the responsible one while getting nothing in return. The house that was supposed to be Dan's inheritance? It's where my kid will be growing up soon. Sarah's pregnant with our first, a boy. And if we have more children later, they'll all be treated equally. Update 1. It's been 2 months since my last post. Living with my parents in the garage apartment has been interesting. I was worried they'd fall back into old patterns, but it's been different. Dad works at the hardware store and gives me rent money monthly. It's not much, $600, but it's about the principle. For the first time, I feel respected. Last weekend, we replaced deck boards together. He told me his own father compared him to his brother too. Makes me wonder if this golden child thing is a family tradition. Mom's trying in her own way. She's helping Sarah with nursery preparations and brought over our old baby clothes. The most surprising thing? I overheard her bragging about me to her sister. Kyle landed another major account. Always knew he'd do well, so responsible. From the woman who barely acknowledged my existence when Dan was around. Speaking of Dan, he's back in Minnesota. His Florida fresh start lasted 3 months before he got fired and evicted. He's crashing on a friend's couch. Mom mentioned this at dinner, looking guilty about breaking our "don't mention Dan" rule. I said it was fine as long as they weren't sending him money or trying to move him back in. We wouldn't do that, Dad said firmly. We've learned our lesson. Dan texts Mom constantly. She tries hiding it, but steps outside for his calls with a worried look. Last week, Dan showed up unannounced while I was working. He tried convincing Sarah to let him grab some stuff from the basement. When she refused, saying he needed to contact me directly, he threw a fit, calling her names, claiming she turned me against him and ruined our family. Sarah called me immediately. I came home to find her shaken. She's 7 months pregnant and doesn't need the stress. I called Dan warning that if he showed up uninvited again, I'd get a restraining order. It's my house too. I grew up there just like you did. I reminded him it's legally my house and he was evicted for a reason. 2 days later, a neighbor caught him trying to break in through our back door. Police found him jimmying a window. He wasn't arrested after claiming a misunderstanding, but received a warning. My parents were horrified and, for once, made no excuses for him. We changed all the locks. Dan started bombarding me with messages, first angry ones about stealing his inheritance and turning our parents against him. When I didn't respond, he switched to apologies, claiming he was ready to make things right and just needed a place to stay and a small loan. Then came guilt trips, old family photos with messages like, "Remember when we were brothers," and "We're still family." Most manipulatively, "Don't you think Mom and Dad have been through enough? They just want to see their sons getting along." I finally responded that if he cared about our parents' well-being, he wouldn't have exploited them financially for years. I'd consider a relationship if he demonstrated actual change, steady job, paying bills, taking responsibility instead of blaming others. His defensive reply, "You have no idea what I've been through. It's easy judging from your perfect life with your perfect wife and house. Some of us have real struggles." Meanwhile, Melissa is thriving. She found an apartment, works steadily at the boutique, and is taking business classes at community college. She filed for divorce, which Dan is purposely complicating by forgetting appointments and signatures. Despite this, she's blossomed, made new friends, goes to the gym, even changed her hairstyle. She and Sarah have lunch weekly, and she's helping with baby preparations. She'll be our son's godmother. Dan was furious about this. "You're letting my wife be your kid's godmother instead of me? How could you betray me?" I reminded him that Melissa wouldn't be his wife much longer. Godparenting requires responsibility, which he's never shown, and it's our choice, not his entitlement. We've finished the nursery in Dan's old room, a symbolic choice. I built a rocking chair by hand, which Sarah calls the most thoughtful gift ever. Dad helped install better heating, and Mom brings baby items almost daily. It's strange having my parents so involved after being an afterthought for years. I keep expecting them to compare me to Dan, but it hasn't happened. 3 weeks ago, Dad told me seriously that Dan had asked for money. I told him no, Dad said firmly. "We can't help him anymore. We're rebuilding our relationship with you, and he needs to figure things out himself." I was speechless. This from the man who'd spent decades enabling Dan? He didn't take it well, Dad continued. said terrible things about all of us. But we're done enabling him. We see the damage we did to him by never enforcing consequences, and to you by always putting you second. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to hug him, part wanted to ask where this insight had been for 27 years. I just said, "Thank you for telling me." Dad added, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I don't deserve it. But we're trying to be better." Sarah later said, "People can change when they get a reality check. I'm unsure if my parents have truly changed or if this is temporary. Maybe they'll revert when the baby arrives or when Dan inevitably hits bottom again. But for now, I have control over my life. My house is legally mine, my business thrives, my marriage is strong, and I'll be a father in 2 months. If anyone tries disrupting that, I can set boundaries. No more being the afterthought or unappreciated safety net." Dan's now staying at a weekly motel after losing his friend's couch. Mom worried but didn't ask me to help progress. He's badmouthing me to anyone who'll listen, claiming I stole his inheritance out of jealousy. I don't care. The people who matter know the truth. Reality is he's 32 and never kept a job over 6 months. He's burned through relationships, credit cards, and goodwill. He's never faced consequences he couldn't charm his way out of until now. Maybe this will be his rock bottom. Maybe he'll finally grow up. I hope so, but won't hold my breath. I'm focusing on my future, Sarah, our baby, our home, my business. For the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I should be. It took 27 years and cutting off my golden child brother to get here, but better late than never. Update 2, it's been 4 months since my last update. Our son, James, was born 8 weeks ago. He's healthy, beautiful, and has completely changed our lives. Sarah had a smooth delivery. Holding my son for the first time was indescribable. Sarah has taken to motherhood naturally, watching them together makes me fall in love with her all over again. My parents were at the hospital. Mom cried, and Dad had a look I'd never seen before when he held James. He told me, "You're going to be a better father than I ever was." Not bitter, just honest. They've respected our boundaries with the baby. Mom asks before visiting, brings food instead of just gifts, and limits her parenting advice. Dad helps around the house, fixing things, mowing the lawn when I'm exhausted from midnight feedings. Having them in the garage apartment has been helpful. When we're sleep deprived, Mom watches James so we can nap. For the first time, we actually feel like a functional family. Now for Dan. His downward spiral accelerated after James was born. When Mom told him about his nephew, he immediately asked if we'd named the baby after him. Learning we'd chosen Sarah's grandfather's name, he complained I was erasing him from the family. He never contacted us directly. Instead, he sent flowers to my mother with a card reading, "To the grandmother of my nephew. Love, your first son, Dan." Mom quickly moved them to their apartment. A week later, Dan texted, "When do I get to meet my nephew?" No congratulations, just demands. I explained we weren't having visitors outside our immediate support system while adjusting to parenthood. He replied, "I'm not a visitor. I'm his uncle. Family gets special privileges. But I guess I'm not family to you anymore, am I?" 2 weeks later, he showed up unannounced. Sarah was napping with James when I found Dan peering through our windows. "Hey, bro. Just thought I'd meet the little guy." I told him to leave. He refused, saying he wouldn't go until he saw his nephew. I remained firm about our boundaries. Boundaries? He's my nephew. Afraid I'll corrupt him? No, Dan. I'm afraid you'll be the same selfish, entitled person you've always been. The one who thinks rules don't apply to him. When he started raising his voice, I threatened to call police, mentioning the neighbors remembered his break-in attempt. He left, but not before saying, "You think you're so better with your perfect little family. Babies are expensive. You'll be begging for help eventually." I installed a Ring doorbell that day. My parents told me Dan had been trying to convince them to sneak James to see him. "Just bring him to the park. Kyle doesn't need to know," he'd told Mom. To her credit, Mom refused. Kyle and Sarah are the parents. They make the rules for their child. Dan started telling extended family I was keeping his nephew from him out of spite. My cousin texted asking why I was being so harsh. My aunt called about fixing things between us. Surprisingly, my parents defended my position. Dad even called relatives to explain Dan wasn't respecting our parenting decisions and had a history of boundary issues. Meanwhile, Dan lost his job at the cell phone store, got evicted from his motel, and claimed he was sleeping in his car, trying to get money from Mom. Dad discovered he was actually couch surfing, drinking heavily, and complaining in bars about his control freak brother, who stole his inheritance. The breaking point came a month ago. Melissa had finalized her divorce and joined us for dinner in the backyard. James was asleep in his bassinet nearby. Dan showed up drunk, having seen Melissa's car. He stumbled into the yard shouting about conspiracies against him. James woke screaming. Sarah took him inside with Melissa while my parents and I dealt with Dan. He was raging incoherently about betrayal. When Dad tried calming him, Dan pushed him hard. Dad fell, hitting his head on the patio edge. Seeing my 65-year-old father bleeding on the ground while Dan continued yelling, something in me snapped. I physically removed Dan from my property, warning him to never return. I called police and pressed charges for assault and trespassing. Dad, after getting 4 stitches, agreed it was necessary. Dan spent the night in jail. The court issued a restraining order protecting all of us, prohibiting him from coming within 500 feet. He's apparently left for Chicago to stay with a cousin and hasn't contacted us since. Melissa has her own apartment now and visits weekly. She's dating a coffee shop owner who seems stable and kind, everything Dan isn't. As for my parents, Dad recently gave me a genuine apology, not just for recent events, but for always putting Dan first and never acknowledging my achievements. I was trying to help the son who seemed to need it more, he said. But I taught Dan he never had to grow up, and taught you your needs didn't matter. I failed you both. I told him I forgave him, not because he deserved instant forgiveness, but because I didn't want to carry that anger anymore, especially with my son watching. Mom's apology has come through actions. She respects our parenting decisions, has stopped comparing me to Dan, treats Sarah like a daughter, and is helpful with James without overstepping. They're talking about getting their own place soon, not because of problems, but because they want independence again. They've been saving from Dad's hardware store job and Mom's new florist position. I've told them they're welcome to stay as needed. Life is exhausting but wonderful. Running my business while being a new dad is challenging, but I've never been happier. Sarah and I are tired but solid. The house that symbolized so much dysfunction has become a true home. The room meant for Dan's return is now where my son sleeps peacefully. The parents who once kicked me out for their golden child now respect my boundaries and contribute positively. I don't know what Dan's future holds. Part of me hopes he'll eventually grow up. A bigger part is simply grateful his chaos is no longer our problem. The enabling cycle is broken, and everyone, except perhaps Dan, is better for it. This experience taught me you can't control how others treat you, but you can control what you accept. I refused to be the family scapegoat, and everything changed as a result. To anyone in similar family dynamics, set boundaries, stick to them, and know your worth. It might get worse before better, but on the other side is a life that's truly yours. My son will never know what it feels like to be the backup child. He'll never wonder if we love his future siblings more. He'll grow up knowing he's valued exactly as he is. And that feels like victory.